It's the summer of 1916, the middle of the First World War, and both sides are desperate for a breakthrough. The Allies had been planning an offensive in northern France for some time, but the German attack on Verdun had raised the stakes. So a plan was hatched for British and French forces to quickly break through the enemy lines around the River Somme. But no plan survives contact with the enemy, and what followed was 4.5 months of bloodshed, with a total of over 1 million casualties. On the first day alone, almost 20,000 British soldiers were killed, and by the end of the battle, the Allies had made gains just a few miles deep. This was the Battle of the Somme. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of the Somme, a bloody battle of attrition on both sides, and one that didn't lead to the decisive breakthrough the Allies had been hoping for. But how significant was it? And if the Germans had crumbled here, what might the remainder of the war have looked like? That's the question for our experts, and joining me, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Parry. And once again on the channel is Professor Alexander Watson, Professor of History at Goldsmiths University. So let's talk about the wider context of where we are in the summer of 1916. We're about halfway through the First World War. And of course, crucially, the Germans have launched an attack on the French at Verdun. But Dr. Parry, to start with you, the lie of the land, I mean, we're very much into kind of trench warfare, attritional warfare, everything associated with the First World War, and both sides are keen for a breakthrough.
That's absolutely right. And what we're talking about here is a battle that takes place a month after the Battle of Jutland. So both sides are assessing what's happened, how they can calibrate the risks. It all goes back really to a conference in 1915 between the French and the British at Chantilly. They say, look, what we need to do is have a combined attack with all our allies on the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. And so what you see is the idea that Russia will attack from the east in quite considerable strength. The Italians will stoke up the front just underneath the Alps here. And the French and the British are going to attack possibly on the line between where the British and the French forces overlap. That's about a third of the way along here. And that plan comes to fruition, and everybody's trying to coordinate these attacks to try and wear the Germans down and give them conflicting priorities. Where it comes unstuck is that the Germans also have a plan. And what they want to do is put a lot of forces in against Verdun, which is a totemic city for the French, and also would lead to quite severe consequences on the road to Paris as well. So in February, von Falkenhayn launches a major attack on Verdun. It's designed to suck the French into a position where the Germans have geographic advantage and have massed loads of sighted artillery. So what the Germans want to do is bleed the French dry in this battle by sucking in more and more troops. At the same time, they're planning with the German Sixth Army to attack the British, the British Fourth Army, in fact, in the middle of the line. And so if that goes well, they're going to attack there. Now, simultaneously, of course, the Allies are trying to do the same. What in fact happens is the French have to divert an awful lot of troops down to Verdun. And their original plan, whereby the French would lead a major attack up here just south of Flanders with the British, gets turned around. And instead of the British supporting the French have to support the British, because the British have got 20 divisions, and because the French have denuded their line to reinforce Verdun, they've only got 13 divisions. So it becomes a British-led operation. Also in December, Sir John French has been replaced by Sir Douglas Haig as the leader of the British Expeditionary Force. And he says, actually, I've got a very untrained army now. Most of the original army we had in 1914 has either been dispersed in other campaigns or I've lost them. And you're starting to see Kitchener's new army very raw at every level particularly at the private and corporal level, but even throughout the command chain. And what you're seeing is much more directive leadership, less initiative being used. And Haig says, actually, I don't want to attack where you want to attack along the River Somme. I'd like to attack into Flanders. But again, he gets overruled. So the basic problem for Haig at the start of this, he has a very untried army. He's got a very directive command system that he has to try and control. And he's not actually fighting in a time and place of his own choice.
I mean, that's a really good point, and I'm sure we will come back to Haig a lot during the course of this discussion, because you're right, you know, he didn't want to fight the Battle of the Somme where it was, when it was, but we'll talk about that more in due course, as I say. Alex, let's bring you in. Welcome back to the channel, first of all.
Thank you.
How much was what was happening at Verdun pivotal to the need to go at the Somme? Because the point about the Somme, and that's where the British and the French forces meet.
So the Somme is at the Somme specifically because the French don't fully trust the British to do their bit. The French have borne the major cost of the war to this point. The British Army has been quite small to start with, but has been expanding. More and more British troops have come into the Western Front through 1915. But the actions that they've seen have been relatively minor compared to what else has been going on. They've fought at Neuve-Chapelle, they fought at Loos, they fought at Aubers Ridge, but the Somme is the real first big test for the British, and the French want to make sure that the British bear their cost in this fighting too. Because you've got to bear in mind that while they're allies in this war, the British and the French are also historically strategic competitors, let's say, too. So the French have the aftermath in mind as well. In terms of Verdun, I'm not sure that it makes a huge amount of difference to how the battle is organised. As Chris has said, this is meant to be a French-led initiative that changes as a result of the attrition that the French suffer at Verdun. But in terms of the timing and in terms of how it's fought, the British aren't in any huge push. By June, July 1916, the French are clearly holding at Verdun. Verdun starts in February. The big danger is February, March. By June, July, the French are holding. And the initiative on the Somme, the offensive on the Somme, is welcome to take the pressure off. But the roots of the Somme, as Chris says, go back to December 1915 and to this Chantilly conference, when it's agreed that there will be offensives right across Europe.
So that's interesting, and maybe we'll get onto this later, but you think the Somme could have actually started later, as Haig originally wanted, and maybe given the British more chance to train up their troops?
Possibly, but I think the whole idea that the British troops are undertrained at this point, I've never been entirely convinced by that. In part because all of the troops, and Chris is right, a lot of them are Kitchener troops, new army troops, men who have volunteered and been brought to the front and trained in wartime. They've had at least 6 months training in the UK, and then most of them have been 9 months, a year already on the Western Front. All of them have been at least 6 months on the Western Front. So these aren't green troops. I see the bigger problems actually further up. If you think about the high command of the British, lots of the generals who find themselves leading armies in mid-1916, if you go back to 1914, you know, they're commanding divisions of 20,000 men. Suddenly they've got to deal with armies of over 100,000. Exactly. Oh, absolutely. And that's really, really difficult.
And Chris, talk to me a bit about where the Germans are at the moment, because, you know, they have got huge pressures on them as well, because they're fighting a multi-front war.
Yes, they are, and they're conscious at this point they've got limited manpower on the Western Front. What's significant, they've probably got about 112 divisions here. They've probably got 50, 60 divisions in the east at this stage, so you can see where their emphasis is. The problem for the Germans really is, unless they can actually make a breakthrough, they're going to continue to bleed to death every time the Allies attack them. And part of the reason that Haig wants to go into Flanders or along the Somme is actually to create a lot of casualties. It's not about gaining ground. This is the key point about the Somme, is to relieve the pressure on Verdun, to take part in the overall European campaign, but also to bleed the Germans as well.
So, seen from the perspective of the Germans, the First World War is the ultimate underdog story. And by the end of the war, the Germans are fighting powers which control 70% of the population of the world. They control 66%, I think, of the world's economic product. And Germany has itself has Austria-Hungary and a couple of other weaker allies, Bulgaria, Ottoman Empire, fighting against what the Kaiser calls the world of enemies. So absolutely, in an attritional war, in a war of grinding down, Germany is constantly at a huge disadvantage. And I think 1916 for the Allies does actually hold a really exciting opportunity because of this agreement made in December 1915. There are attacks in the summer in the east, the so-called Brusilov offensive, around Lutsk here. As Chris has said, you've got the Isonzo, attacked by the Italians, big attacks by the Italians, 3 offensives, Verdun, the Somme. You've got... Blockade, yeah, exactly. You've got a huge push on all sides. And through 1915, the Allies say to themselves, look, the Germans have managed to hold out because our attacks haven't been synchronised. The Germans are operating through internal lines of communication. So when they need troops in the east, they can move them across Germany. When they need troops in the west, they can move them back. Yeah. So they can move their reserves in 1915 to where they want them to be. If this idea goes, we can attack simultaneously, that will make that advantage of internal lines of communication that the Germans have, it will stop that. Now, in 1916, by early 1916, all of the powers know how to break into a trench. That's not a problem. It's not easy to do, but the British, the Germans, the French, they can all break into a trench, get over no man's land, and get into the enemy's first line. What's difficult is, and what's really, really difficult, and this isn't actually solved until 1918, is turning a break-in into a breakthrough, something decisive, a decisive advance. And the Allies are cleverer than they get credit for. They're thinking about what the key problem is, and the key problem in this type of trench warfare is the matter of reserves. The defence are always able to bring up reserves of men, reserves of munitions, and plug any gap in the line before the attackers can. Because the big thing in 1914 to 18 is the railways. As troops move back, they move close to their railheads, which means they can bring their reinforcements up quicker. By contrast, any attacker has to go over devastated ground, moving further away from their railways. So they're in this race, which the attacker always loses. So the idea behind the whole campaign, the whole European campaign of 1916 and the Somme is, if we can eliminate German reserves, we don't have to fight that race anymore, and we can beat the Germans. And that's what the Somme is about.
And it's in that context the Battle of the Somme plays out. So let's zoom in now and let's focus on the events of the battle itself. OK, we're going to get into the battle itself now, but before we do that, let's just run through some of the key stats. And the British had vast superiority in terms of material numbers. They had 19 infantry divisions available and 10 in reserve, 386 aircraft, 393 heavy guns, 933 medium guns, and 1,644 light guns. Together, they suffered 623,000 casualties, around 420,000 British and 200,000 French. The Germans, meanwhile, only had 7 infantry divisions available, with 129 aircraft, 18 heavy guns, 372 medium guns, and 454 light guns. Their casualties were also very heavy, at around 500,000. OK, so let's talk about the battle itself. And the first thing to say, I know you feel very strongly about this, Alex, the Battle of the Somme does not begin on the 1st of July. It begins a week earlier with the bombardment. We'll get into that in just a moment. Just to point out a few of the key places, when we talk about the Battle of the Somme, one of the really key points, I suppose, is the old Roman road, particularly the stretch that runs from Albert up to Bapaume. A couple of other things to point out, of course, that the battle takes its name from the River Somme that runs through northern France, hence the name. And there are lots of key places we'll talk about. Something that always sticks in my memory, Thiepval, which of course is the site of the memorial. If you've ever had the chance to visit the battlefields, that is a very moving experience. Alex, to start with you, let's talk about the bombardment, because that is really key. That is the prelude to the battle itself, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, so that starts on the 24th of June. And the 24th of June, let's be clear on this, is the first day of the Battle of the Somme, especially if you're either a British artilleryman or a German soldier crouched down in your dugout. The bombardment is unprecedented. 2.5 million shells fired in just 1 week. It's just extraordinary, the sheer weight of steel and of brass that goes over and it plunges into German lines. And German soldiers, I've read a lot of German Daries as part of my research, and it's just a nightmare being under this. It's not terribly effective in physical terms because the Germans have built very deep dugouts, especially in their first line. But in terms of the noise of this shell fire coming over and over and over every day through the night, some of the diaries that I've read, by the third or the fourth day of the bombardment, you have German soldiers just saying, let it finish, we want them to come over because this has to stop.
And the aim here, Chris, is to take out, for example, the German barbed wire and to take out machine gun positions. Is that the aim? Is that what they're trying to do?
That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to take out essentially the first and perhaps even the second line of defences. The problem for the Germans is that if you look at the topography, they're actually on the leading edge of the escarpment. So they're actually facing the artillery. Now, the problem for the British is quite a high proportion, up to 30% of these shells are duds. They don't actually explode, they just go into the earth. They're also using shrapnel weapons that basically are anti-personnel shells, which basically spray ball bearings at the speed of sound when they explode. They're not penetrating some of these dug-in positions. The other issue is that the Germans have had advance warning of this attack. They've actually intercepted some intelligence. They've also, there's a story that 2 prisoners of war have actually given them the information, so they've reinforced their defences. They also know from previous experience that they have to sit this out as far as possible and wait to see what happens. But the effect of the bombardment isn't at all what the British expect.
And Alex, are the British very much thinking by the end of the week-long bombardment, they're thinking it has actually been quite effective and they are expecting to be able to march across no man's land and have a far easier time than they end up having?
That's a bit of a myth, the idea that they're going to march across no man's land. There's a lot of preparations that go into this. And they do have some sense of how effective the bombardment has been due to intelligence reports about whether the wire is cut. And to a lesser extent, it's more difficult for British troops to work out how badly the German garrisons have been affected. But the reports by 30th of June are actually very, very mixed. But the British are committed by this point and they go forward. I think to understand some of the British problems, we actually need to think about the planning of this, because there's 2 key figures. There's Henry Rawlinson, commander of the 4th Army, who is the key planner, and then there's his superior, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. And Rawlinson wants what was called a bite and hold operation. So in other words, a short advance, heavy bombardment followed by short advance to take just this first line of
just take a
Germans.
chunk out of the enemy.
Take a chunk, that's right. Then move everything forward and then start again. Haig says, no, it's not enough. We can go for something more decisive here. And he moves the objectives back so that on the first day, the British are also meant to take the German second line too. And crucially, that dilutes the bombardment. It massively dilutes it. And as a result, the bombardment, this contributes to the ineffectiveness of the bombardment. Huge numbers of shells being fired over, but they don't do the job that they're intended to. And one counterfactual that perhaps we could discuss is if they'd stuck with the original plan, Rollinson's plan, would this have actually been more successful?
I mean, I think it's worth actually outlining what the plan is. The plan is that Rollinson's 4th Army here is the main spearhead of this attack, but you're getting diversionary attacks from the 3rd Army and also the French 6th Army. There's 3 corps here down in this area. And so the Germans are distracted by that. But Alex is right. The artillery is very much dispersed in terms of its effect. And one of the things they learned during the Somme is that you concentrate your artillery fire on specific points that you want to attack and weak points as well. That doesn't happen here. So a lot of the 2 million or so shells are either duds, as we've said, or they're actually dispersed over a wide area and don't actually take out the targets they're intended to.
And Alex, it's probably worth talking a little bit about what the German lines look like and what their trench network essentially looks like, because it is incredibly advanced by this point in the war.
Yeah, if you go back to December 1914, a trench network is one line of trenches. By mid-1916, the German network on the Somme has 3 trench systems one behind the other. And each of those trench systems will have 3 lines in it. And then you've also got intermediate strong points, redoubts, which are designed for all-round defence between the middle of those lines as well. So getting through this is going to be a huge, huge challenge. It's going to take a huge amount of shells, and it's going to take blood as well. And the British know that. They're aware of that right from the start. But initially, at least, Rawlinson is pretty confident that that first line can be taken precisely because it is on the forward side of the slope. Artillery observation is good, and they can bombard it and get in. They know how to do that.
So let's talk about what happens once the bombardment stops. What is known often as the first day of the battle, but as you rightly say, Alex, it's not really. But the 1st of July, talk us through, Chris, what happens, because it's gone down in history as a slaughter, really.
Yes, well, it turns out that the British are going to attack the strongest point of the German defences. That's both by luck and judgment on the German side. But the key point is that what Rollinson's 4th Army is supposed to do is actually punch and hold for a reserve army to come through and exploit that gap. Now, the problem is there's a terrible tangle of logistics and all sorts of things behind because actually, as Alex sort of hinted out earlier, these commanders are not used to coordinating forces on this scale. These are brand new armies in some ways, and quite a lot of the officer corps are inexperienced. They're very enthusiastic, but they are inexperienced. So there's a lot of directive leadership required here to make this happen. And unfortunately, people say, well, we know what our objectives are. We've got to keep piling in troops to achieve that. The bombardment hasn't done its duty. The Germans were also warned by a huge mine being blown up on Hawthorne Ridge. As part of it, they got 10 minutes warning the attack was about to happen. But here's the thing. The diversionary attack by the French is succeeding really well down here. And the difference here is the terrain, but also the fact that the German army opposite had been denuded of troops both to reinforce Verdun, but also to reinforce the 6th Army that was going to do the counter-strike when the British attacked to try and relieve Verdun. That was part of the original Falkenhayn plan. But the French do quite well on the first day, and the Germans have to actually send reinforcements from the centre to be able to deal with that. So it's not all disaster. The other problem for the British is their tactical coordination is poor. Instead of actually sort of synchronizing their attacks, they sequence them. So the Germans say, right, we've dealt with the first wave. Oh, here's another one. We'll deal with that in the same way. And they keep reinforcing failure in that respect. Very brave, but I'm afraid pointless on the first day.
Yeah, the failure of the bombardment to knock out German machine guns and also actually German artillery. It's worth bearing in mind that 2/3 of the guns that the British have are told to concentrate on clearing barbed wire. And you've only got the remaining third that are meant to take out the dugouts where the machine guns are sheltering, ready to be brought up once the attack begins, the German machine guns. And, of course, there's very little for counter-battery fire. And artillery is the major killer of the First World War as well. And it's reckoned that about 30% of British casualties actually happen before even the British troops get to their own parapet. Yeah. They don't happen in no man's land. It's British troops moving up behind their own lines. And the failure of the bombardment to remove those machine guns, remove that artillery fire, cost the British very dear on the 1st of July, 1916.
But then also the failure to clear the barbed wire. I mean, practically, if you are trying to traverse no man's land and you are having to very slowly navigate your way over this barbed wire, presumably that makes you a sitting duck for the German machine guns.
It does, but it's really, really tough to clear barbed wire in 1916, in part because of the technology that you've got available. High explosive is in short supply and is really needed to destroy dugouts. So the British are using shrapnel, and you've got to get the shrapnel. Shrapnel blows out these ball bearings out and forward. So you've got to be very, very precise in order to actually use it to cut the barbed wire. And British gunners are fairly inexperienced at this point. And in some places it works well, but in many it doesn't. But as I said, there are plenty of British troops who simply don't even get to no man's land and are killed by machine gunners. The death zone extends behind British lines as well as in front of them.
And Chris, Alex made an interesting point earlier that there is a bit of a myth about how well trained, or more to the point, how poorly trained these British troops may have been. But what is certainly true is that a lot of these are Kitchener's troops. These are PALS battalions.
Yeah, it's rather like a football team. You can get people together, but if they're not match fit, they're not going to fight in this complex environment. There were quite a few complaints after the first week about troops not being able to get into trenches properly. Although they've learned the lessons from before, they haven't been transmitted down. There's ineffective tactical leadership down at the company and also platoon and section levels. And they're short of things like grenades, bombs, as they call them. They're short of quite a lot of the equipment they use for breaching barbed wire. But the main problem is there's just too many moving parts. And you can see the general is not able to coordinate action. You can see in the war journals of the various regiments that they're trying to do stuff, but they're not really sure what they're supposed to be doing in support of the overall aim. So it's this lack of experience. And the key message for me from the Battle of the Somme, it's rather like the naval battle of Guadalcanal. You're learning by doing. So halfway through this, the 18th Division says, you know, we're really fed up with this going across no man's land during the day. What we're going to do is we're going to go basically and lie down in no man's land overnight.
Yeah.
We'll risk the barrage and then we'll attack halfway across. So that sort of thing is learnt as they go through. So the Somme is all about learning by doing. And I'm afraid to say that quite a lot of the regiments that are raised, particularly the PALS battalions, very inexperienced and green at this sort of warfare and intensity.
Alex, let's talk about what happens after the 1st of July, because there's a lot of focus on it because of how brutal it was, particularly for the British. Almost 20,000 British soldiers are killed on that day alone. But then for the remainder of the battle, I mean, what, 4.5 months then? Talk us through the progress. And they do make some progress, the British and the French.
They make some progress, but I see this battle as above all mismanaged. I think it's got huge potential, and I think it's mismanaged in part because those objectives, as we've talked about, were simply too far forward. But also later, after, well, maybe we go back. So after the 1st of July, there is a pause because the British have taken these huge casualties. They need time to reorganise and go forward. Next big attack is on the 14th of July, and that's what Chris was alluding to, and that's actually a night attack, which is difficult for troops to do. And I think the fact that British troops, these new troops, are able to do that does show that they've been rather underestimated in a lot of quarters. And the 14th of July is a pretty big success. The bombardment is more intense than on the 1st of July.
And focused.
And focused, exactly. Yeah, it's over a shorter front.
Yeah.
And they're able to capture a significant part between Auvilliers and Hardecourt of the 2nd German line. So the 14th of July is actually a pretty big success, big push forward. But then Haig and his generals kind of lose it. You get lots of really small battalion-level attacks through July, through August, through the middle of September, which for sure keeps some pressure on the Germans. But it's not concentrated force, there's no decisive point of attack, and it costs the British hugely. So I'd argue that actually through that crucial summer period, British generals don't have the control over the battle that they should. And if you look at the German casualty rates for the summer of 1916, although we think of that first day, July, as a disaster, actually the British inflict more casualties in the first 10 days of July than any other 10-day period right through the battle. And I think that's a sign of a battle mismanaged.
There's a famous letter from an officer in the Royal Welsh. He writes back and says, it's like capturing castles, this campaign. And that's exactly what it is. It's strong points, it's fortified villages. And what Haig tries to do is work his way along south of this Roman road between Albert and Bapaume. They then switch later on to the north, and that's where you get Thiepval and Pozières. Very interesting point about Pozières, the Australians. A lot of Commonwealth troops involved in this, New Zealanders and others. The Australians lost more at Pozières than they did at Gallipoli. And yet Gallipoli is really famous.
Yeah, and yet Gallipoli stuck in the national psyche, yeah.
But overall, this is basically trying to get positions of advantage. Remember, it was never about taking ground. It's about basically inflicting as much damage on the Germans as you can and trying to deflect them away from Verdun.
Yes, well, let's talk about that. How are the Germans reacting, and are they diverting resources from Verdun?
They're not actually diverting that many resources from Verdun because essentially they're holding the ground here. What's really surprising is that the Sixth Army is maintained here in all its strength. Because two reasons. One is they can't believe they're not being attacked up this front here as well. They saw the diversion and contained that. But also, they're still thinking about driving in here as well, behind the British lines. That's still in the plan. So they hold. They don't tend to divert too many resources. And in a tactical action like this, they can say, fine, each time we see a new attack, we'll deal with it. And again, they reposition their artillery and they're ready with their fortifications to take on the British and to an extent the French as well in the south. French have done really quite well here in the south. And to me, that shows you the difference between a match-fit army and one that at the start of the Somme wasn't match-fit.
French have more artillery, they have more heavy artillery, and that makes a big difference on 1st of July. In terms of artillery, it's worth emphasising as well, just again, the sheer quantity of steel that's being thrown into German lines, 19 million shells over the course of the battle. The Germans coined this term, Materialschlacht, battles of material, because they are fighting the full might, not just of British industry, but of industry from North America as well. A lot of these poor quality shells are brought in from America and Canada. And for the Germans, the psychological impact of this battle is immense. If you look at the psychiatric casualty rates, especially in north of the River Somme, where the British are fighting, it's double anywhere else. It's just, this is a really grinding, difficult battle for the Germans to cope with, for German troops. And the Germans are having to, they develop a new army, they bring in a new army, they have Second Army originally fighting, and that's split into two with new troops. 20 divisions are brought in by 20th of July, so you get First Army and Second Army, two armies fighting here. And they're burning through divisions, and new division is needed every other day in order to hold the British back. They're under huge pressure, despite the lack of advance.
So by November, how far have the Allies actually got?
Well, it depends on the depth that you're talking about, but they've probably gone about 6 miles. But remember, it's not about taking ground. It's about bringing the Germans in, flooding in those resources to stop them actually being able to work elsewhere. I think at this point, it's worth bringing in the fact that in the east, you've got a massive offensive by the Russians. And they've achieved a huge success against the Austro-Hungarians and also the Germans. They've killed, captured or injured nearly 1.5 million Germans and Austro-Hungarians. So the Germans are slightly distracted by that, but not enough to actually divert huge amounts of resources to the east. So at the end of the battle, you've got 120 German divisions along the front in the west, 78 in the east. But of course, it is a distraction because the Russians have achieved an absolutely stunning success. It's probably the most successful battle in the whole of the First World War on land, which hardly anybody knows about.
But before we come on to how the Battle of the Somme could have played out differently, we probably should just take a moment to discuss the impact of it in reality, because it has gone down, particularly in the British psyche, as kind of emblematic of the horror, and some might say even the futility of the First World War. You think of Blackadder Goes Forth and all that kind of stuff. And yet, despite the relatively limited gains, could you not make the argument, Alex, that actually 500,000 German casualties, it was designed to grind down the Germans. It does that, and one of the long-term historical consequences is that the Germans turn increasingly to U-boat warfare, which eventually brings in the Americans to the war. So it's a hugely consequential
Before
battle,
Alex comes in on that, James,
yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning that the result of this is that Falkenhayn is sacked, the German commander-in-chief, and he's replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff from the east. And what Falkenhayn had said is, we're going to do basically unyielding defence here. And everybody's saying, we're getting killed, we're getting injured. Hindenburg arrives with Ludendorff and says, we're not going to do that. we're going to, in stages, come back to prepared defences. And by March 1917, they're actually 28 miles behind the front in a thing called the Hindenburg Line, which is a prepared defensive line. And ironically, as a result of the Somme, the Germans have come back 28 miles, which is the greatest depth that the Allies have actually gained in the whole of the war so far.
It's a really good point, Alex. Do you want to come in on that?
Well, also, just thinking about the military legacy of the Somme, I mean, there is an argument to be made that this is where modern warfare is made, is created. The Germans, by the end of the Somme, their fixed lines have been so bombed out that you have machine guns in shell holes, you have a much more flexible movement rather than fighting in lines, which paves the way for what Chris was talking about. These are big elastic defence systems where, rather than holding ground, defenders allow attackers to come in and then counterattack. This is very much what you see in 1917, 1918, Second World War as well, this elastic type of defence, much more flexible movement style type of defence, and you get the origins of that on the Somme. For the British as well, they're learning. Chris made the point that this is a learning battle, and it is. The idea of the creeping barrage, this bombardment, artillery bombardment, which moves in front of troops, clearing German machine gunners from shell holes, obliterating everything in front of it, becomes the major tactic of 1917.
But it becomes more subtle and focused later, though. That's
true.
The point.
It does. It does. That's true. But this is the origins of it for the British. This is where they're doing it. So we are seeing a new type of warfare, which ultimately paves the way for bigger breakthroughs on both sides in 1918, begin in 1916 on the Somme.
And we should say as well, the Battle of the Somme is where we first see a tank.
Yes, we do. On the 15th of September, Fleur here. Unfortunately, they weren't very reliable mechanically, and by the end of the day, there's only one actually serviceable. But of course, the Germans went, "What is that?" And it creates absolute mayhem initially until these things break down and the Germans are able to stabilise the situation. The other thing that's worth mentioning is there's a lot of aircraft flying around at the moment. They're actually trying to pick up intelligence. They're actually dropping very small bombs. They're trying to shoot each other down. So there's quite a lot of aviation going on over the battlefield of the Somme at this stage.
And the British have air superiority, which is, again, is another reason why, arguably, with a better plan, they could have done better, because having air superiority means that you can have more accurate artillery fire. And the Germans are blind because the British and the French rule the air.
Hold that thought. We've talked about the real history of the Battle of the Somme. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, let's ask ourselves now, could the Battle of the Somme played out differently? Chris, Parry, to start with you. I mean, could the Germans actually have, I don't know whether you'd say won, but maybe broken through at the Somme?
I would say, in terms of a defensive operation, the Germans did succeed because they actually held quite a substantial attack. But I think we need to go back to the original plan that Falkenhayn had to fix the French army down at Verdun. At the same time, have the Sixth Army ready to actually counterattack any relieving strike by the British in the centre here, and what that would have caused. Now, we mentioned already that the Third Army and the Sixth Army are here. I think you'd have probably then had an almighty battle here to stop this encirclement taking place, or even a breakthrough here. You've still got reserves amongst the Germans here to flood through. Now, it would then be a dash for Paris. And I don't think that the Germans actually had the momentum or indeed the logistics and mobility to do that, as I said, with two armies on their flanks. So the best you could have done is a spoiling action here and then gone back to the lines here. But you've taken the British out on the boundary between the French and the British. So that was a possibility. That would have been a tactical, operational victory, perhaps, but not a strategic one.
And that's predicated, of course, on the Germans first bleeding the French dry successfully at Verdun, and then still having enough reserves of their own to then attack the British. And, of course, all of that goes horribly wrong even before the Battle of the Somme begins.
But as I said, you know, the Sixth Army was kept in being despite all that was going on. Falkenhayn had made sure the Sixth Army stayed strong. He didn't deplete the troops to actually deal with things elsewhere.
I want to ask you, Alex, about Rollinsons' plan in just a moment, but just focusing on Haig's plan, what we actually saw at the Somme, is there anything they could have done to make it work better?
If they'd used Haig's plan?
Yeah.
Probably not. And the reason why is that the decisive weapon on the Western Front through the First World War is artillery, and especially heavy artillery. And the British simply don't have enough heavy artillery. We can talk about infantry tactics, we can talk about whether the British infantry were well prepared or not so well prepared, but in the end, you've got that statistic of 30% not even reaching their own front line, never mind the Germans. If the artillery isn't there to pave the way forward, then the British infantry aren't going to have the chance. And I don't think the British didn't have the artillery.
Same in Ukraine today. Look at the difference between the Ukrainian ability to fire shells and also the Russians at the moment. It makes up for quite a lot of deficiencies on the Russian side.
OK, well, here's a what if. What if they went with Rollinsons' plan and they decided, a bit more limited, but we're just going to take a chunk out of the German line? Could that have made the Battle of the Somme achieved essentially the same things for the British, but with fewer casualties?
So you see, that I feel more positive about, as far as you can feel positive about the Somme. I think it would have done. I think that the rough calculation is you need 1 gun per 1,000 yards of line. And if you can bombard with that artillery intensity, you can get your troops through. The British had found this at Neuve-Chapelle, and Rawlinson had thought this through. Neuve-Chapelle was a battle which took place in 1915. He'd absorbed some of the lessons from that. And if the British just try to take the first line, then of course their bombardment is much more intense, much heavier, just like the French bombardment was down in the south. And as we can see, the French do well in the south because of that heavy bombardment. Rawlinson tries this in 1917. There's a battle in spring 1917 called the Battle of Arras. And he tries this bite and hold step by step. You capture the first line, you bombard, you capture the first line, you then bring your artillery up, you bombard the second, and then you put the infantry forward again. And that works very, very well in the spring. Causes the Germans a huge amount of panic. If the British had followed that plan in 1916, in July of 1916, the Somme still would have been very bloody. There would have been huge casualties. There's no doubt about that. But they would have been far fewer than the plan that Field Marshal Haig pushed forward.
Chris, do you agree with that?
I think it's a great plan. I just don't think that the army as a whole was trained to do that. They hadn't operated together in any way, shape or form. Quite a lot of these regiments are replacement regiments, so they haven't seen action before in some of these other places. So maybe if they'd had more time, they'd have got the coordination right in doing that. There's no doubt that is a turning point in terms of tactical procedures that actually gives the Allies a significant advantage. And of course, they're actually producing more specialist weapons by this stage as well. And as the war goes on after this, you're seeing more coming off the production line, and the Germans aren't able to match that at all.
And Alex, you do get this kind of sense, and you still hear it today, springing from battles such as the Somme, that the troops were let down essentially by their generals. You get this idea of lions led by donkeys. Where do you stand on that?
So I think from the relatively comfortable perspective of Britain in the 21st century, it's really, really easy to say, oh, they should have done this and they should have done that and they should have done the other. And we've already made the point that Haig and the generals below him had been commanding far, far smaller formations than the formations, the corps and the armies that they end up commanding in July 1916.
And this was not the battle that Haig wanted. He wanted to fight in Flanders and later.
Although when he does fight in Flanders in 1917, that doesn't necessarily go so great either. Let's bear that in mind. So I don't think it was easy for Haig and the High Command, and they were up against a formidable army in the Germans, unquestionably. But I think ultimately, even with those provisos, Haig and British commanders, senior commanders, do fail the troops in 1916. I think there were better options available, and not just options from historians. I think Rawlinson's plan was a better option, and I think they should have gone with that.
Chris, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, my view is to change a military culture takes time. I mean, Churchill famously said, you know, far harder than getting a new idea into a military brain is getting an old one out. And so, a classic case here. And the campaign itself, as I've mentioned before, is a learning process. And I'm afraid to say you learn with your people's blood. You look at, again, I refer to the naval battle of Guadalcanal, huge losses by the American Navy. But at the end of it, they had what was called battle-mindedness. And I see the whole of the Somme being a process by which this vast new army gets battle-minded. And you see coming off the back of it all these new techniques. You see trained troops actually being able to do something more significant afterwards. The problem is they're sacrificed, again, in needless operations at Passchendaele and places like that. What concerns me about the Somme is its very limited objectives. Remember, to divert attention away from Verdun and also to make the Germans suffer huge casualties. Although that's significant, and as Alex and I both know, the Germans say, we can't take another Somme. So it's successful in that respect. But when you look at the overall strategy of the war, I'm not sure how it contributes at that point, except indirectly.
OK, well, we've looked at how the Battle of the Somme might have played out differently. Now, let's do what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some big, long-term questions. If it had played out differently, what might the world look like now? OK, let's zoom out again now and ask ourselves, had the Battle of the Somme played out differently, what would that mean for the rest of the war? Alex, to start with you, does it change that much? Because you could make the argument, look, long term, it does succeed in grinding down the Germans. It does lead them to say, we don't want another Battle of the Somme. Let's turn to U-boat warfare. That brings in the US. So fundamentally, if it was a more decisive British victory, does that actually change anything?
Well, I think yes and no. So in the context of offensives in the east, the Italian offensive, Verdun and the Somme, the Germans are under unprecedented pressure in the summer of 1916. The plan that the Allies had developed at the end of 1915 is coming to fruition in the sense that they've coordinated their offensives August 1916, huge time of pressure. So I think there are opportunities in that sense, if everybody is pushing, if perhaps the Italians had been more effective, if the Romanians as well here had not been knocked out so quickly in August, if the British had come forward more effectively on the Somme. But the no part comes in insofar as the Somme itself, and Chris made this point, there aren't any clear objectives. No. The Somme battlefield is chosen because it's relatively smooth and easy to advance across, and because the French and the British armies happen to join here. So even if the British had advanced further, there's no decisive objective that they can win to knock the Germans out in a flash. That's not going to happen.
Chris?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, if you look at the planning documents, you look at the submissions that are put up to the War Cabinet, there's no indication that once we break through, we're going to go all the way to Berlin or anything like that. So as I hinted earlier, the strategic objectives are all lacking here. It's a demonstration in many ways of our capability to the French, and it's designed, as we said, with very limited objectives. What I find interesting is reading some of the commentary in the newspapers of the time of the fact that we've had basically Jutland, didn't win that. We've now got the Somme, didn't win that. We're fed up with draws. We need to get on with it. And there was a very pronounced movement in Britain at the time to say, should we be doing this? Because we're not exactly winning at the moment. So there's just a slight tremor in 1916. Now, if you look at what the army itself is saying at this time is, yep, we've taken a real hit here, but we have learnt a lot and we are going to plan differently in future. We also know we can rely on the French. There's quite a lot of that coursing through the letters and documents. I haven't seen the French side, whether they trust us at this point, but there is a sense that the French do think that the British have taken a lot of casualties here. They're like us. So we're sacrificing equally here.
So it strengthens the alliance, really?
I think it strengthens determination. The other point is that it's the start, really, of a period where every country in this conflict has started industrial scale warfare. Everything is mobilised in their countries and societies to fight this war. So you're on the leading edge of that. So again, countries themselves are exploring what that means for them and what it means for strategy and tactics as well. And so I see a seamless web through from the Battle of the Somme to the battles of 1918, where the context actually is even worse for the Germans in terms of the way the blockade has been squeezed. They've stopped recruiting as many people as they've been able to. They're running out of manpower. So it's the start of a journey in modern parlance. And without the Somme, that journey doesn't start.
Could also maybe think about psychological aspects of war. I mean, we've talked about the war, we've talked about the Somme as a battle of material, you know, the British firing over 90 million shells, 150,000 shells a day. To some context, the Russians fire about 10,000 shells a day in Ukraine, so 150,000 shells, just extraordinary. But in the end, the First World War ends through a morale collapse on the German side. It ends through material but also psychological attrition in 1918. And it's quite unexpected. You know, in the summer of 1918, Allied generals, British, French, Americans, they're not expecting that the war will end in 1918. It ends in 1919. So in these wars of psychology, morale wars, there's always the unexpected. And of course, Haig, in July 1916, is so keen for a decisive advance through German lines because he thinks if we can get that decisive advance, if we can get the Germans on the run, their morale will collapse.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, because do you think the Battle of the Somme could ever have been that kind of decisive battle? I mean, I take Haig's point that maybe it leads to a psychological impact that way, but, you know, really was the Battle of the Somme never going to be a battle that could win the war either way?
Well, the German army is a tough army to crack. You know, its troops don't surrender easily, they don't desert easily, and they don't run easily. In 1918, they do begin to surrender in large numbers, but not so much in 1916. You do see a rise in surrenders toward the end of the Somme, October, November, on the German side. So there is perhaps some sign that certainly German troops are getting worn down, they're getting tired. And it's one of those great history unknowns. I think in and of itself, could the Somme have won the First World War? No. But when you put it in the context of the big Russian offensive at Lutsk, what the Italians are doing on the Isonzo, the battering the Germans had taken, as well as the French at Verdun, then suddenly you can begin to understand why contemporaries thought maybe this could be it. One big push and we're through.
I mean, the key point is the Germans at no stage thought we're going to lose the war at this stage. They're thinking, you know, we can't take any more of this punishment in the way the Somme was inflicted on us, but there's no sense we're going to lose. So until, as Alex says, until you break the will of an opponent, which is entirely what you're supposed to do in warfare, you're not going to achieve the victory that you want. And you might also say that the Germans themselves believed that in 1918. It wasn't the army that broke, and this is the myth of the stab in the back. It's the morale at home under the pressure of the blockade and the ceaseless sort of pressure around the whole German and Austrian empires that actually brought it about. But of itself, you don't see people referring back to the Somme in the 2 years between the 1916 and 1918.
No.
That's the key point. And then when you look at memoirs afterwards, the Somme isn't actually seen as a critical turning point at all.
Chris, is there any scenario in which the psychological impact on the Germans at the time of the Battle of the Somme and this sense afterwards of we cannot have another Somme? I mean, had Falkenhayn's plan worked, for instance, had they been able to launch a spoiling operation, had that then, as a result, not led to them doubling down on the U-boat tactics that brought in the Americans eventually in 1917, could that not have fundamentally shifted the war?
There's some personality issues involved in this. Now, part of what Ludendorff was saying about we can't afford another Somme was actually a critique of Falkenhayn's leadership and command. So there's part of that. It's to do with intra-German army politics and things like that. But there's no doubt that at this point, the Germans said, we got a lucky escape there. They could have broken through. So how are we going to expand this war to keep the pressure off ourselves and to put some pressure on the Allies? And the answer is Ludendorff is banging the drum very loudly for unrestricted submarine warfare. In turn, of course, that brings the Americans in, along with the Zimmermann telegram, and it gives the Germans exactly what they don't want, is lots more materiel, lots more manpower to actually put pressure on them, particularly on the Western Front.
And just to finish off, Alex, is that not the key point, really, about the significance of the Battle of the Somme? It's not the battle itself that makes it so significant, but it's the wider context. It's where it sits in what is happening in the summer of 1914. It's the multi-front war that the Germans are facing. It's the naval blockade. It's the fact that they weren't able to make a breakthrough at Jutland. Is that really the context in which we should see the significance of the Somme?
Yeah, so I think actually there's a lesson for all of us. There's a lot of focus on the media in any war. You see it in Russia and Ukraine as well, about very tiny advances in trench warfare. Is this important? Oh, look, they've advanced so far, In the end, much more important is both the broader geopolitical strategy, which we've looked at, but also psychology. What's going on in people's heads? What's going on in the heads of ordinary German soldiers? And crucially, what's going on in the heads of their generals as well? I think Chris's point about how the German military high command, after the Somme, comes to support this disastrous idea of unrestricted submarine warfare. These discussions go on in January 1917. Ludendorff says explicitly, our troops can't face another Battle of the Somme. Actually, they could. German troops went through Passchendaele. They went through a range of other awful battles. But he says they can't. And the Germans opt for this disastrous submarine strategy, which brings the US into the war and seals Germany's fate. So inadvertently, not by plan, not by organisation, not by the winning of territory, the Somme does end up as a decisive battle.
Well, what's really interesting is that Ludendorff and Hindenburg, very successful in the East, find themselves a bit out of their depth when they come to the Western Front. I'm not sure why that is, because of the legacy that they inherit, or indeed their personalities and ways of operating are totally different. But there's a fundamental shift. And as we've said, Ludendorff arrives and says, you know, we're not staying here. We're going to go back another 26 miles, 28 miles to this prepared line. And the whole philosophy of the way the Germans approach the Western Front changes, not just because they've got new generals there in charge, but also because the way of fighting actually it does not adapt as quickly as the way the Allies do.
Well, look, gents, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much. I'm afraid that is all we got time for. My thanks to Professor Alexander Watson and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like and subscribe to History Undone on YouTube. And you can also now listen, follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.